Hi, you are watching Look Up channel. My name is Yuriy Matsarsky, and today I would like to talk about allies of Putin's Russia. For several decades of the 20th century, our planet lived in a rather tough confrontation between two systems, a communist one oriented towards the Soviet Union and a democratic Western system. But the Soviet system turned out to be absolutely unviable. It collapsed, bearing the entire communist camp under it. Even states that formally still remain loyal to the ideas of Marx and Engels, for example China or Vietnam, in fact live according to capitalist principles, do not prohibit private property and encourage business initiative. But in the modern Russian historical myth, the USSR did not die on its own. It was destroyed by the efforts of internal and external enemies. The people who represent the modern Russian government were formed back in the days of the USSR. The Soviet Union favored them with apartments, high salaries, cars and quality food. All that was simply inaccessible to ordinary people. Instead of apartments and sausages, the Soviet Union gave these ordinary people a sense of belonging to something great. We have half of the world behind us. America is afraid of us. We put missiles where we want and we can smash the world into dust. Propaganda drove these thoughts into the heads of Soviet people every day. This feeling of resentment towards the enemies who destroyed the USSR, the feeling that they were deprived of something great, did not fade away in the Russians. On the contrary, with the help of the same propaganda, it has been inflated again to unprecedented level. As in Soviet times, this propaganda is used as a smoke screen. With its help, the authorities divert people's attention from their machinations, from palaces and offshores. After all, what is a stolen couple of hundreds of billions against the global confrontation with the entire West? Therefore, the more shamelessly the Russian government steals, the more brazenly it violates laws and neglects the rules, the more propaganda inflates people's hatred for the West and democracy. Soviet times are perceived by many Russians as a golden age, and not at all because they or their ancestors lived well and richly then. This is not the case at all, but because the Russians are sure that it was then that Russia was feared and reckoned with. It had many clients and allies around the world. Almost half of the globe was painted in red, the color of communism. And such a painted globe is very necessary for both Putin and his subjects. Having allies and clients from other countries gives them the feeling that they are not alone, which means they are right. And the Russians are trying with all their might and by all means to get themselves allies around the world, but it does not come out very well. Having started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine under an absolutely fictitious pretext, Russia instantly dropped out of the list of countries with which the democratic world is ready to deal. More and more new sanctions are being introduced against Russia and Russian companies, and soon the Western world will stop any noticeable economic interaction with the Russians. Even the previously loyal satellites from among the post-Soviet countries such as Kazakhstan, Armenia or Turkmenistan are increasingly moving away from the Kremlin, even if in words they remain faithful to it. Moscow is forced to look for new allies, both to build economic cooperation. After all, you have to sell oil and gas to someone and to emphasize its status as the leader of the entire Western world. Since countries built on law and respect for human rights do not want to deal with criminal Russia and are unlikely to want to do it in the foreseeable future, Moscow is building warm relations with rogue states and absolutely terrorist regimes. If I were a fiction writer, I would call the union of countries that has developed around modern Russia an alliance of greed and aggression. Just look who Moscow lists as its partners: Syria, whose self-proclaimed authorities have been been killing their own citizens for more than a decade. Belarus is another country ruled by impostor who did not care about his people, who staged repressions because of which the country was left almost 10% of its population. By the way, it will be necessary to make a separate episode about Belarus. Who else is Russia's friend? Venezuela, whose rulers wanted to annoy the West so much that they destroyed their own economy and at the same time education, healthcare and in general or almost all state institutions. Money is worth nothing there. The death rate is like in the Middle Ages, but there are a number of agreements with Russia, including an agreement on cooperation in space. Hard to believe that it is not a Monty Python's flying circus sketch. By the way, Russia also has an agreement on cooperation in space with Zimbabwe. Let me remind you that Zimbabwe does not have its own space program, but there are enormous problems with respect for even basic human rights. About 100,000 inhabitants of the country live in slavery. They work for meager food and a roof over their heads with no hope for something better. I can imagine how happy they were to learn that their government suddenly showed such concern for Russians in space. Another country with a virtual slave system that is now listed as a partner of the Russians is North Korea. There, forced labor is ubiquitous. The majority of the population lives off meager handouts from the state, and new sneakers or jeans are considered a luxury. Of course, it is with this country that Russia has developed especially warm relations. After all, North Korea is ruled by war-obsessed fanatics who have amassed an almost endless stockpile of shells and missiles that Russia so badly needs right now. Who else is on the list of Russia's friends? Hamas. These have been there for a long time. The Russians have been feeding them for years, so that Israel, which is at war with Hamas, does not greatly interfere with Moscow's intrigues in the Middle East. Such a state-level blackmail. Either you don't interfere in our affairs or we will overwhelm Hamas with weapons and money. The Taliban are new acquisition of Moscow. The Russians have already developed very warm relations with bearded Afghans. But the trouble is that the Taliban are proud guys, but poor. They are ready to buy Russian oil, but they can only pay for it with raisins or dried apricots. For some reason, the Russians did not agree to such a deal. So for now, Kabul and Moscow have a real sincere romance without any material background. The rest of the countries are not particularly in a hurry to run towards Russia, even when they do business on the wild war unleashed by the Russians. Iran began to supply its attack drones to the Russians, but officially it denies these deliveries. That means that Iran is semi-officially represented in the alliance of greed and aggressions. Iranians help murderers and murderers, but they are ashamed of it, or they are not ashamed, but they are afraid to fall under new sanctions. After all, those who have a sense of shame, a sense of self-respect, will never help the Russian in the genocide they unleashed. See you!